All right, let's get back to this issue of causality. As I mentioned before the break, what many atheists are doing now, because the evidence points so clearly to a beginning of the universe, that in order to avoid the obvious implication that a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, personal creator must have caused the universe, many atheists are just denying that the universe needs a cause. They say it could come into existence out of nothing without a cause. Well, my friend William Lane Craig asks an excellent question. He says, if atheists are going to claim that the universe can pop into existence uncaused out of nothing, then why doesn't everything do so? Really, why don't iPads, Teslas, atheist books, MacBook Pros, pizzas pop into existence out of nothing? I mean, think about this. If you're hungry for a pizza right now, does it make more sense to order one or just to wait and hope? Of course, order one. I mean, talk about faith. Why are the atheists who say they're always following the evidence where it leads, and that they're champions of science, why is it that when scientific evidence points to what could be considered a theistic God, they suddenly get weak in the knees? In fact, Lawrence Krauss, who is an atheist and a physicist from Arizona State University out there in Phoenix, Arizona, wrote a book, as many of you know, called A Universe from Nothing, Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing. Now, that sounds really good. He thinks he's, by the title, you'd think, well, Krauss has figured out how the universe could come into existence out of nothing without a cause, or without God, at least. But after you go a little bit deeper, you realize the devil is in the details. And what are the details? Krauss says that the cause of the universe was not God. It is, quote, unquote, nothing. It's just nothing. But his nothing isn't the nothing from which the universe really came. His nothing is not non-being, as the evidence points, but what he considers to be the quantum vacuum. And the quantum vacuum is something that actually is something. It's not nothing. It's not non-being. The quantum vacuum consists of fields of fluctuating energy from which particles appear to pop into and out of existence. Now, whether these particles are caused or not is unknown. I mean, what probably is going on is when you look at the quantum vacuum, you're disturbing the quantum vacuum in order to see it, in order to observe it, and that is what's causing these unpredictable occurrences. You know, we can't seem to predict the simultaneous speed and location of subatomic particles. This is called the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And so some atheists are saying, well, that just shows that that these things aren't caused. They just pop into existence out of no, not necessarily. It could be that your very effort to observe the subatomic world is causing these erratic movements. I mean, if you, say, put a photon of light off a car, the photon of light isn't going to cause the car to move erratically. But if you bounce a photon of light off a subatomic particle, which may be smaller or have a lower mass than a photon of light, then you could see the photon may cause that particle to move. And so that actually could be the reason why we see these erratic movements. But all that is beside the point. The point is that what Krauss is trying to say in his book is actually what we call in logic equivocation. He's using the word nothing in two different senses. He's not using the word nothing to actually literally mean non-being or no thing. He's using the word nothing to mean the quantum vacuum, which isn't nothing. It's something. And something had to cause the quantum vacuum. In fact, there's a professor from Columbia University. His name is Albert. His last name is Dr. Let me get his first name here. It's David. Dr. David Albert. He's a PhD in theoretical physics. He's an atheist himself. He's written a book called Quantum Mechanics and Experience. And in the New York Times a couple of years ago, he actually wrote a scathing review of Krauss's book, pointing out that Krauss is not telling the truth about what nothing really is. When Krauss tries to say that the quantum vacuum is nothing, here is literally what Dr. Albert wrote in the New York Times. He said, that's just not right. He said, quantum field vacuum states, no less than giraffes or refrigerators or solar systems, are particular arrangements of elementary physical stuff. He says the fact that some arrangements of fields happen to correspond to the existence of particles and some don't is not a whit more mysterious than the fact that some of the possible arrangements of my fingers happen to correspond to the existence of a fist and some don't. And the fact that particles can pop in and out of existence over time as those fields rearrange themselves is not a whit more mysterious than the fact that fists can pop in and out of existence over time as my fingers rearrange themselves. And none of these poppings, if you look at them right, amount to anything even remotely in the neighborhood of creation from nothing. End quote. Basically, Dr. Albert lands the knockout blow to Krauss with what he just said, and then he adds this, believe it or not. He says, quote, "But all there is to say about this, as far as I can see, is that Krauss is dead wrong, and his religious and philosophical critics are absolutely right." Again, this is coming from a man who's an atheist, who teaches at Columbia University. And by the way, Columbia University is not known for Christian fundamentalism. Now, of course, Krauss didn't take all this lying down. He got up off the canvas and fought back. And you know how he fought back? He called Dr. Albert, quote, "a moronic philosopher," unquote. Now, it's a mystery to me why Krauss took the time to craft such an eloquent refutation of Dr. Albert. I mean, especially when Dr. Krauss himself actually admits Dr. Albert's point in advance. In fact, in several places in his book, in Krauss's book, Krauss acknowledges that the nothing he's talking about is not exactly the nothing from which the universe came. So Krauss is actually admitting what Dr. Albert has pointed out. And you know what Krauss does? He gets real annoyed anyway. And he says, "I don't give a blank what nothing means to philosophers. I care about the nothing of reality, and the nothing of reality is full of stuff. I'll go with that." Yeah, the problem for Dr. Krauss is the nothing of reality, the physical stuff that he's talking about, had a cause. It had a beginning. And so his position here collapses upon itself. He actually explains nothing. And he gets all annoyed with Dr. Albert and people who are pointing out that he is equivocating on nothing, that he just comes across as someone who's not really dealing with these arguments in a direct manner. So Krauss actually has explained nothing, and his disdain for philosophy actually creates a big problem. Krauss thinks, well, you don't need philosophy. As I point out in the book, you can't do science without philosophy. Science is built on philosophy. And I can understand how Krauss can be upset with some philosophers and some wacky philosophy out there. I've studied a lot of wacky philosophy myself, and so I can sympathize with them. But the existence of wacky philosophy doesn't discredit the existence of good philosophy any more than the existence of wacky science discredits the existence of good science. I mean, you can use bad philosophy to do science, but you can't use no philosophy. It's impossible. All scientists are using philosophy, whether they know it or not. Science is built on metaphysical, philosophical principles. In fact, when they try and figure out, what is relevant, what's rational, what's the best interpretation of the data, what exactly is or isn't nothing, those are all questions that are answered through philosophy. They're not answered by science. Science doesn't interpret the data. Science doesn't gather the data. Science doesn't know what's rational. That's philosophy that does that. In fact, science is more done in the mind than it's done in the lab. Think about all the philosophical judgments a scientist must make through the scientific process. Think about it. He's got to gather the data. He's got to interpret the data. Nature doesn't gather the data. Nature doesn't interpret the data. And the data doesn't evaluate itself or interpret itself. The mind of the scientist does, and all that requires philosophy. And by the way, that's why there's a PhD behind anybody who gets a doctorate, or the PhD stands for philosophy of, or the PH stands for philosophy of whatever. philosophy of physics, philosophy of biology, philosophy of chemistry, whatever it is, philosophy undergirds everything we do. So for somebody like Krauss to diss philosophy, he's actually dissing science, because you can't do science without philosophy. In fact, you can't even read the newspaper without philosophy. And we'll cover more of this right after the break. You're listening to Cross-Examined with Frank Turek on the AFR Talk Radio Network. Back in 2. Welcome back to Cross-Examined with Frank Turek on the AFR Talk Radio Network. We're talking about stealing from God, why atheists need God to make their case. That's my new book, just out this past week. And we're talking about the chapter on causality. And we were talking before the break about Lawrence Krauss and how Krauss equivocates on the word nothing. The nothing that he is talking about is not the nothing from which the universe came. And then Krauss also cast doubt on the law of causality. We were talking about this at the top of the program. Here's what he says. And he's discussing the vexing problem of the beginning of the universe. I told you that atheists are having trouble at the beginning of the universe. And here's what Krauss says. He says, quote, all things that begin may have a cause, even if the cause is rather obscure and purposeless, unquote. Now, my question is this, may have a cause? What happened to simply all things that begin do have a cause? Why does he suddenly doubt the law of causality? Because, look, when he has an argument he thinks disproves God, he uses causality. And when he has an argument that he thinks, might point to God, he suddenly abandons the law of causality. Well, what he's doing is he's actually abandoning the very law that is required to do something that he is very, very passionate about, and that is science. I mean, if Dr. Krauss cast doubt on the law of causality, then he cast doubt on the very discipline he's trying to champion, science. At the foundation of science is the law of causality. Cause and effect. And Krauss goes on a little bit further. After he doubts the law of causality, he says this, and see if you can figure out the problem with this statement. He says, however, what is important to note is that every known physical effect whose cause we understand has a physical cause. There is no reason, therefore, to assume the same will not be true of our universe itself. In other words, the only type of cause we know about is the physical cause. So you can't talk about God because he's not physical. So whatever created the universe has to be physical. Well, here's the problem. The problem is there was nothing physical ontologically prior to the universe coming into existence. There was no space, no matter, no time. So this is Krauss's way of saying, well, whatever caused the universe can't be something that is immaterial, spaceless, timeless, like God. Well, why is he saying that? Because he wants to avoid God, obviously. The problem is, by avoiding God, you know what he's actually done? He's actually made it impossible for us to believe anything he says. You say, why? Well, I would like to ask Dr. Krauss a couple of questions. The one question I'd like to ask him is, Dr. Krauss, are you merely a physical being? In other words, are you nothing but a collection of molecules? Or are there also immaterial aspects to you? Now, no matter how he answers, he's going to be in trouble here. Why? Because if he says no, well, let me back up. Let me clarify the question a little bit more. I would also ask him this. What do you believe about your mind and your brain? Do you think you are just a brain, or do you think you have a mind? Because if you're just a brain, then everything's just physical. But obviously, if you have a mind, everything isn't just physical. Because I would want to ask him, what produced your book? Your book that we're talking about here, The Universe from Nothing. Did your brain produce it, or did your mind produce it? Now, of course, your mind depends on your brain to a certain extent, quite obviously. But if everything that you think and you wrote in the book is just based on molecules in motion of your brain, and there's no real you there, there's no self, there's no soul, there's no mind, there's no immaterial reality over which you have any control, then why should we believe anything you say, Dr. Krauss? Why should we believe what you write in your book? If you're just a product of a previous physical, natural cause over which you have no control, then how can we trust anything you say? See, so when Krauss says everything must have a physical cause, then that must include his book. Well, if his book had just a physical cause, there's no reason to believe anything he writes in his book is true, because everything he's written is a result of a previous physical, natural cause over which he had no control. In other words, this materialistic viewpoint that Krauss and other atheists have defeats their own arguments. You see, materialists like Dr. Krauss have no other choice than to assert that our thoughts are determined completely by physical reactions in the brain. This is from my book, Stealing from God, Why Atheists Need God to Make Their Case. For a materialist, the laws of physics determine everything we think and do. If that's the case, if we are mere meat machines without free will, then we have no justification to believe anything we think, including any thought that atheism is true. As meat machines completely determined by the laws of physics, we cannot reason, we can only react. Doug Wilson, who debated Christopher Hitchens, I think at least a couple of times, said this in one of his debates. He said, we are no different than a Coke can fizzing. I mean, if atheism's true, if we're just molecules in motion. Now, how can a fizzing can of Coke reason or do science? It can't. It can, of course. So, with his assertion that all causality is physical, Dr. Krauss has destroyed himself along with our ability to reason and do science. And this is one of the ways, I think, in which atheism contradicts all common sense. Right now, you're listening to this podcast. You are freely listening to this podcast or this radio program right now. And you're freely thinking about, hopefully you're thinking about what I'm saying. You're not merely a molecular computer who has no control over what you're doing or what you're thinking. And if you were, there would be no way in principle you could discover that. Because any intellectual process you use to discover that would itself be completely determined by the laws of physics. I mean, in order to know you're a robot, you'd have to be more than a robot. Wow. I know that's a lot to think about. I know that analyzing these atheistic claims is a lot like trying to gargle peanut butter. But that's because this is self-defeating material here. And self-defeating statements sometimes require you to slow down, reflect a little bit on what's being said. But it's important because if you can identify self-defeating statements, if you can identify contradictory statements or statements that can't be true because they defeat themselves, it's going to save you a lot of time. In fact, I submit to you that half of what good apologists do is just uncover illogical, erroneous thinking or statements, self-defeating statements. In fact, the book, Stealing from God, largely uses what Dr. Geisler and I called in, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, the roadrunner tactic. We're just using the law of non-contradiction to point out that what these atheists are saying actually is self-defeating. They defeat themselves. And when you get good at identifying self-defeating statements, you're going to see a central problem that emerges when you evaluate atheist claims. And this central problem emerges throughout this new book that we're talking about here today. Here's the central problem. What atheists do is they often exempt themselves from their own theories. What we've just talked about is a good example. I mean, if everyone is a molecular machine, then why do atheists act as if they can freely and reasonably arrive at atheistic conclusions? If everybody's a moist robot, why do atheists act like they are not moist robots? Daniel Dennett, one of the new atheists, says that consciousness is an illusion. Well, one wonders if Dennett was conscious when he said that. I mean, think about this. How could you know that consciousness is an illusion? You would have to have some kind of super consciousness to know that the mere consciousness that we mortals have isn't true consciousness, that it's an illusion. You'd have to be beyond the illusion to know it's an illusion. Just like, how do you know you're having a dream? You don't know you're having a dream while you're dreaming. You only know you've had a dream after you wake up, when you get the more than knowledge of waking up. The same is true with trying to say that consciousness is an illusion. you'd have to be beyond consciousness, or beyond the illusion, I should say, to know that you're just having an illusion. He also says, as does Sam Harris, that we don't have free will. Well, then, if we don't have free will because we're just molecular machines, did you freely come to that conclusion? And if you didn't, then why should we believe it? If the conclusion that nobody has free will was arrived at by some sort of deterministic process of physics, why should we believe it to be true? See, atheists destroy themselves with their own theories. They exempt themselves from their own theories, but the theory comes back and bites them, just as it bites everybody else. You see, the real issue here is that you can't make an intellectual case for atheism without assuming materialism is false. In other words, you can't make a case for materialism unless materialism is false, which, of course, is self-defeating. So there are so many problems with this atheistic viewpoint, and I go through a lot more of them in the book that we can't go through all of them here. But just getting used to identifying self-defeating statements is so critical. If you really want to get good at discovering what is false and ensuring that what you believe is true, you got to get good at discovering self-defeating statements and self-defeating theories. Because the atheists they're just replete with these. They're everywhere. In fact, in every chapter of this book, Stealing from God, there's some sort of self-defeating problem with an atheist argument or claim. Sometimes several of them. So you've got to get good at it. You've got to get good at identifying